Gotby out, Nash in. We've got a whole bunch of questions. If you haven't heard the news, Vancouver FC, they've mutually parted ways with their only ever head coach, Afshin Gotby. 76 games with the club, in charge in all competitions, 16, 22, 38. Missed the playoffs in all of the seasons and currently sit in the 8th and final position in the CPL. Alex, as I said, that kind of leaves us with a million questions here. So I'm going to throw two at you at once to start. Why now, and why was this the right move for Vancouver FC?
Yeah, in terms of why now, I mean, I think the results kind of speak for themselves. It's something where it's been a tough season for Vancouver. Of course, it's been a tough 3 seasons. Granted, they've been an expansion team, and there's obviously challenges that come with that. On and off the field, there's so much work you have to do, so much to juggle. It's never easy to build a squad from scratch. Little things, details you might take for granted, such as identifying leaders, building cohesion in a locker room can be a lot easier to do when you have years of experience and when you're going up against the league where a lot of the teams are, established and have built that sort of identity over time. They've been playing catch up. At the same time, by year 2, they had a very good roster, pushed for the playoffs, but kind of fizzled out after a strong start. You kind of wonder, okay, they, a bit of a worry with how it ended. All right, just hit the ground running in year 3. And, given the record where, they're on pace for the worst Canadian Premier League season, they haven't hit the ground running. And again, there's still a lot of quality players on the roster. They've done a good job of, getting some CPL guys who have experience. Immediately think of the Callum Irvings, the Kunle Data Lukes, et cetera. They had Alejandro Diaz up front for the last few years. Of course, he departed. You got Terran Campbell still. You've built up some impressive youngsters. You got a guy like Nicholas Mosquita, who's been an asset. But, they haven't played up to their full potential, at least in terms of results. And so I think they've, decided that, given the roster they have and where they're at in the season, where they still have a huge champ game to play for, they still have 13 games in the league to try and narrow that gap that York United's been widening every week. They thought, why not now? And, I think it's timing-wise, it makes sense, although I am a bit surprised because I did wonder if this could have been something maybe earlier in the year, but still plenty of runway.
Yeah, I think the biggest number for me in all of this is 56, which is the number of different players that have appeared for the club in 2.5 seasons. Like that's just way too many. Like that's almost 3 full complete squads of 23 in 2.5 seasons. And it's always going to be difficult to start a team from scratch. As you said, you're going to bring in guys, they're not going to fit the identity, but being able to kind of maintain a core group when you're trying to build something is so important, and they've never been able to really do that from season to season. There's just been so much turnover. You look at the few guys who have remained there, Callum Irving obviously being the main one they've been able to carry through, but otherwise it's just been so many different players chopping and changing in and out. They haven't really had a set identity, and when you're heading into a midway through a third season, that's plenty of time, I think, to figure that out and at least find more consistency and find ways to keep some of those important players that have come through. So that's obviously going to be an issue, and part of the reason I think that they've decided to make this decision. Now they find themselves in a tough spot, as we've said, 13 games left, 13 points out of the playoffs. And Martin Nash coming in. Obviously, we know he's not going to be the full replacement. He's an interim head coach right now. They're bringing him actually in as their head of academy. So he'll work with a lot of the younger players as well, transitioning them up into the first team, which we know is a stated goal of this club. And one of the things they want to do going forward is to continue to produce young players. And maybe if there is a positive from Gotby's time within the club, it is, a lot of young players made their debuts. Grady McDonald moved on to a higher level, but from a first team performance perspective, Alex, what's top of Martin Nash's list right now? What does he need to get done to take this Vancouver FC team, back to being competitive within this league?
Yeah, I think the big thing is to find an identity. I think that's been the biggest thing Vancouver have struggled with. They've had glimpses, Afshin Gotby's mentioned what he thought the team's identity could be, right? I think he mentioned on day one, attacking. entertaining, front foot, pressing. And, that's very sounds all exciting and good, but the reality is we didn't maybe see a whole lot of, those things, at least not on a regular basis. And granted, sometimes as a coach, it's a challenge because you can have a way of wanting to play, and maybe, you don't have the roster to do so, or, maybe that's a style that takes time to implement. But, you can also adjust and pivot. Your identity can be fluid. Your identity can vary. The reality is they've, struggled defensively throughout all 3 years. It really, in particular, which is tough. You can't be leaking goals the way you have been, and now where they have offensive weapons, where they entered this year with the 2 top CPL goal scorers, and then a Mesquite underneath, guys who can feed them the ball. They were still struggling to regularly get goals to drop, to get chances. So I think the big thing is to just start building an identity for, the rest of this season, then building into next year. And from there, figure out which players best fit that identity, which guys can maybe be built around. Now there's some guys who have really been around this team for a while, the Irvings, the Vasco Fries, you think of Tierno Ba. There's guys that have been around that are, they can look at this project and be pillars. And then that puts you in an off season where once that identity is set, and the culture is reset, so to speak, but then you can start focusing on recruitment to support that. But I think the identity is a big one because, again, you mentioned the 56. It's hard to have an identity when there's so many new players. So I think there's really going to be a chance to just see what you got in the squad and try to build something tangible for going forward.
And in terms of what Martin Nash will build, I mean, we have a bit of a kind of cheat sheet because we've seen him as a coach in this league before. Obviously, started out with Cavalry and then spent those seasons with York United. So what can we expect from Martin Nash and a Martin Nash coach team tactically from what we saw in those York United teams? And obviously, made the playoffs with them. He's going to coach Vancouver in a Canadian Championship semifinal. He has experience doing that with York United against the Vancouver Whitecaps a few years ago. So, what can we expect from Martin Nash as, a tactician?
Yeah, I think his York teams were always pretty solid. They weren't always the flashiest, but they were usually pretty organized, disciplined. I think you could tell he kind of carried some of those philosophies from his time at Cavalry as an assistant, working with the Tommy Wilden Jr. So I think for Vancouver, he'll want to, again, make them organized and hard to play against. I think that's a good start, especially with those defensive numbers I've mentioned earlier. Again, they're one of the worst defensive teams. I think only Valor is kind of, bested them in that regard. So I would immediately look at those York teams where you think of some of the, like 4-4-2 off the ball, disciplined, able to stay organized. And then from there, giving his attackers some freedom to try and get going. So I think if he can get this team to play somewhere like, I guess, 2023 York, right, where they made the playoffs, made some noise, that would be a pretty good marker for this Vancouver team to start with heading into this half season.
So we've answered maybe 4 of a million questions there. There's a lot more, obviously, when anytime a new coach comes in, which players will maybe reemerge, which players will drop out. There's a bunch more, but for now, we'll leave you there. And obviously, this is a discussion that's going to be ongoing as, Vancouver FC kind of enter a different era as a club. The Afshin Gotby era over, the Martin Nash era, however that looks, begins.